My name is David Hopkins, and welcome to our Global Timber Supply webinar. We're doing this as part of our World of Wood series. We've had a whole series of talks and a festival called World of Wood Festival at the Building Centre and online, really to coincide with the talks of COP26 and to look at and give a perspective on all of the different aspects of timber supply, timber construction, timber design, and a range of speakers from all over the world to try and share knowledge, to share ideas, and to promote the use of wood across all manner of markets. Today's session is really to look at what has been going on in the market and in the supply chain from a number of different angles. We often do this with our softwood conference and our market statements and in our meetings. Today, we wanted to give a truly global perspective on global timber trade supplies and what is coming from where it's going to. I think everybody on this call will realize that the past year has seen supply chains suffer extreme pressures of demand, logistics, supply problems, and so on, as the world has grappled with a fairly unbelievable and global pandemic. It's knocked all trade sideways, I think, not just in the timber sector, but across all different sectors. And we saw problems as the pandemic came into being and started to unfold. And we're seeing other problems now as it starts to recede or markets start to open up again, and the demand booms again as markets try to open up, and that puts increased pressure once again on logistics, supply, and so on. So today we're going to be looking at this from the point of view of the softwood markets, the hardwood markets in the UK, Europe, the US, and feeling very sorry for one speaker who has to cope with the rest of the world as a topic. And we're going to be looking at what's been happening in that supply, but also to discuss a lot of the questions that we've been asked that tie in with the themes, particularly of COP26. We know that timber is promoted, certainly by ourselves, as one of the many solutions to the problems of climate change, that we can start to decarbonize our built environment through greater use of timber in design and construction. And we've been asked, or it's been at the front of a lot of people's minds during this time, will we have enough wood to cope with the increased demand? Where will that come from? We've seen these problems in supply. Does this mean we're going to run out of wood? Those are the sorts of questions we're going to be asking. At the end of the session, I'm going to introduce our individual speakers. And then at the end of hearing all of the presentations, we will be opening up to a Q&A and debate session with everybody. And we do want questions in from the audience, from everybody who's tuned in today. Please use either the Q&A or the chat function on your screens. We will pick those up and we'll be able to field those towards the end of the session. So please do chip in with any questions that you have. But in the meantime, I will start the ball rolling with our first speaker here. And I'd like to introduce Stuart Goodall, the Chief Executive of CONFOR, the Confederation of Forest and Timber in the UK, to give a perspective from the UK sawmillers' view. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Hopefully you'll be able to see my presentation on screen. I'm going to provide an insight to UK wood supply, but also related to that, UK government aspirations for trees and timber, and how producing wood is a priority, or perhaps not such a priority, when it comes to new planting and how we manage our forests here in the UK. So, is this a second? My slide to move down, apologies. There we go. The UK is not the most afforested country in the world, as many of you may be aware. We currently have 13% forest cover. However, we're also the second largest net importer of timber in the world after to China. In 2020, the UK imported the equivalent of £7.5 billion in wood products, ranging from sawn wood to wood panels and paper. And these imports supplement the available domestic timber and support the production of a variety of products. We harvested in 2020 just over 10 million tonnes of softwood. Over 60% of that came from Scottish forests. That's why I have a Scottish accent. I'm based in Edinburgh because we produce most of the trees here. And more than half of that ends up in sawmills and then produces a range of products which end up in everything from construction through fencing to pallets and a range of other uses. What we have seen in recent years is an increase in the consumption of wood for wood fuel. And this is an interesting point for us. It's something which has appeared relatively recently, and it has been intended in some ways just as a stopgap while other renewable energies come on tap. And it raises a question longer term about how we make use of that material and whether there's scope to be putting that into longer lasting, longer lived, higher carbon benefit materials. So the big issue for us for many years has been tree planting, because we went from 5% forest cover at the beginning of the 20th century to 13% where we are just now. And there was a real effort in the 20th century to expand the forest resource by planting many more trees. That came to a bit of a halt, a crashing halt in the late 1980s, as there was concern that the drivers, the purposes of those forests we were planting were too narrowly focused only on timber production. And essentially we've seen the pendulum swing in the other direction. And from planting quite a lot, we went to plant very little. And what we were planting, very little of that was intended to ever produce any wood, which has had consequences which I'll come on to later. However, in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in tree planting as part of the UK's efforts to achieve net zero by 2050. We were one of the first countries to set that their objective back in 2019, I think it was. And since then, it's become an increasing part of election manifestos, both within the UK government, but also in the devolved governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And at the last election, we had a bidding war to see who could make the most bold claims about how many forests they would plant. The Conservative Party won the election, if not the bidding war, and said 30,000 hectares a year. However, for those of you who can add up quickly, you can see that the figures there don't add up to 30,000 hectares. In fact, last year, 13,000 hectares were planted across the whole of the UK, with most of that happening in Scotland. And at the moment, I think there's little confidence that we'll be achieving the government's target of 30,000 hectares a year by 2024. And there's also a question about, again, what kind of forest those will be. From a wood supply perspective, there's a real concern that we're taking just too long to get a handle on this issue of tree planting and producing wood, because as we see from projections that we have about future wood availability in the UK, there's going to be a reduction in availability from about 2030, and that falls away into the 2040s and 50s. So just as we are all trying to use more wood to decarbonize our construction industry, for example, and build more with wood, use more wood generally, the wood is less available than it has been for many decades. And that's of a real concern to us, especially against the background of global demand soaring. We see many forecasts of just how much wood the world may wish to consume by 2050. So we have lots of trees being planted, but are they the trees that we need to supply wood? So we have different trees, we have different purposes, and we have different approaches. And that's probably a good summary of what's happening across the UK. And I think what's interesting for me is essentially in the UK and in the devolved countries or the individual countries of the UK, that there are quite different perspectives about why we should have woodlands and why we should create more woodlands and for what purpose. And it would be true to say that in the UK, probably as a result of us clearing so much of the forest that we had right up until the beginning of the 20th century, there isn't much understanding and awareness of woodlands and forests and managing forests and the purposes behind that. So we've really been reconnecting with our woodlands and why we have them. And in that, there's obviously a big role for whoever can communicate to the public, whether that's government or environmental organizations. And this is a very complex table, but the point I'm trying to communicate here is that if you look at the kind of questions that the UK government asks in England about why we should have woodland, there's lots of mention of people and wildlife, but very little about economy and wood products. Whereas in Scotland, where there is more planting taking place, the questions around economy, rural jobs, things like that are much more significant. And as a result, what we see in terms of responses is, while 92% of people in Scotland believe that forests are important for wildlife, 72% also recognise it's important to have woodlands and create more forests to supply wood processors. So looking ahead, securing a green future, which is something that governments are very keen to do post-pandemic, we've got a real question on our hands. So we can see that there is this real demand to plant more trees, but then a strong perspective that should be for biodiversity, should be for people, and not for wood production, or not necessarily for wood production. And unfortunately, what we then also have is an association that people see planting conifers as part of a mixed forest, for example, on the left-hand side, as something which doesn't deliver for biodiversity or doesn't deliver for people and access as well as wood production, whereas that's clearly not the case. And there's a romanticized version of what we should be doing, which is on the right-hand side, is that all woodland should be native or broadleaf trees, and from that we'll deliver everything that we want, which is primarily about wildlife and access. We've done quite a lot of research recently looking to challenge these assumptions, these simplistic assumptions, and looking at the available evidence. We've compiled a report, and essentially what that shows is that there are two main things. One, that a mixed productive forest, which include conifers, can be as diverse for wildlife as an unmanaged native woodland is. The key thing is about management and having diversity of species, and that we follow modern productive design practices, and that unmanaged broadleaf woodland would deliver more for biodiversity if it was managed. And there's a simple proxy there, which is by bringing those wood into management and producing wood, you let in light, and therefore wood production is in no way at odds with delivering the wider benefits that society is looking for from our forests. But there is a big challenge here, and something that we need to look at in terms of the media, because the media itself in the UK often creates this sense that there is an either-or issue here between production and the delivery of wider benefits, and we really need to get on and tackle that and overcome that issue if we're going to look at the issues of future wood supply and the benefits that that provides, as well as answering concerns about carbon and climate change. And one thing that we are focusing in particular on is sort of looking at what the farming sector does, where people don't necessarily like the idea of killing animals for food, but there's a recognition that it's what happens and it's important. Clearly with forestry, we do something far less gruesome than that, and also much more beneficial. But we are using that simple concept of how can we show the end product as a means to demonstrate the need for the production in the first place. And it was interesting that at COP26, there was this house on the left-hand side, in the top left, which was displayed using Scottish wood. And this was widely praised as being a very positive thing to do. And we all know very well about the issues of decarbonisation, the properties of that for decarbonising construction and building by using more wood. So we're looking to link those two things up. We are starting to see some improvements and responses from the UK government in terms of recognition in new strategies, which identify that there is a role for timber, and that it's moving away from that outdated perspective of native good and productive bad. And we've also seen the countries of Scotland and Wales start to develop strategies for how we can use more wood. Clearly, there's a desire to link that to domestic production, but as I've said, we aren't able to provide the supply that we need within the UK. So there's always going to be a big need there for imports as well. But that then brings us back to part of the central point of the discussions that we're going to have today, which is, here in the UK, we face many challenges. There's a growing demand for timber, falling future availability of wood. There is that disconnect with the public that we're seeking to address. And all of that raises an important question for us in the UK, which is, how do we satisfy a hunger to use more wood? And how can we ensure that planting and managing forests to produce wood is recognised as a good thing? Thank you for your attention, and back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was very good indeed. I would be very interested to certainly to hear from our audience whether or not what they think the impact of the low carbon agenda for buildings will have for forests, for woodland, for planting, and for people's perception of productive forestry. It's a very live debate in the UK, certainly, as you've shown. So thank you very much, and we'll come back to those questions later. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, if I may, covering the perspective globally, but certainly from the point of view of a European sawmiller. I'd like to introduce Ollie Berg, the Marketing and Business Development Director for Setra. Ollie, over to you, please.
Let's see if I can get this thing in order. Oh, here.
That's it.
Can you see this?
Yeah, we can see that. If you just go to full screen mode.
Yeah, I'm trying to. So here we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will give a little bit perspective of what we think or what we can see for market coming the coming year, which is of course very difficult, and you might not share the analysis and so on. But this is, as David said, a little bit viewed from our perspective as a sawmill producer, in this case in Sweden. Starting with looking at the underlying growth. This is the chart from IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and what we can see here is that in 2021 the growth figures in globally was very high, which was not unexpected due to it was a recovery then from the pandemic outburst in 2020. But also in 2022, we see significant growth figures, expectations in many countries, and not only in these high growth numbers in these major economies, in these areas where we normally have a little bit higher growth, like China, India, and so on, but also in the major economies in Europe, UK, as well as Germany and France and so on, but also a very good growth in US, and of course driven by as some form of coming back from the pandemic, but as well as also that is so much money put into the system that is working in favor of various consumptions, we believe. So that underlying growth is looking very good. And the question is, what kind of a bearing does it have then on our business? When we look at the consumption development of softwood, this is showing Europe and North America. So China is not including here. We can see that it's, even though that 2021 being a very, very high growth year, it's still growing a little bit in 2022 as well, and by some million, both in Europe and North America. And if you actually it's grow a little bit in North America, yeah, I think that the growth perspective for Canada is a little bit down, but it's a little bit more up in the US. So not a significant growth, but remaining at a pretty good level. And if you go back to 2017, 18, prior to the pandemic, it is a significant recovery, which is then accounted for basically by the US housing start recovery. If we look then, there are four main areas when we look at, besides Europe and the domestic market, we have Middle East and North Africa, we have US, we have China as the big areas of consumption that we rely on as producers here in Europe. And we tend to be much more, especially if you go north in Sweden and Finland, we are much more export oriented, while if you go to the German industry or they have a significant part of their own production, which is very big, by the way, in their domestic market. But export is very, very important for us. If you look at the European outlook, and this is Euroconstruct, and then we can see that the housing start in the European area is looking flat, but at reasonable levels. And the numbers you can see on the left-hand side, that the numbers that are prior to the financial crisis are maybe today not comparable. But what is kind of missing, if you go back to that time, we had an absolute global new housing hype. And what's missing in Europe is that the South European countries like Spain, Greece, Italy is not at all coming back, while Germany, France, and UK, and Netherlands and so on are back on good new housing stock level. Also, prior to 2008, there was quite a big building boom in the former East European countries. So 2022 shows in housing start pretty much same level of activity as it done 2021. What is more surprising than to see, and whether that happens or not, is that the R&M sector, the building renovation in the European area, is still moving upwards from 2021. This could be, of course, questioned if I look depending on the impact of when we are lifting the pandemic restrictions, the COVID restriction. It's certainly been noticeable that in the most countries globally, that the R&M sector has been, activity in this sector has been going down, that we are now competing with money, home renovation are competing against traveling and restaurant visits and so on. There is, of course, in Europe, different prospects depending on what country you're talking about. And if I would say, for us, the main consuming markets, UK is the biggest export market for Swedish suppliers, and UK is showing very good, showing an upward growth in both housing start and the R&M sector. Whether that is too optimistic and so on, but at least it shows that the activity will remain on a high level. France is also showing a very good figure, and the Benelux countries, while Germany, you can see a slight downturn both in new housing start and in R&M, build on these projections. But looking fairly okay. Moving over to Middle East and North Africa, and this is a very important market for Sweden and Finland. And almost 50% of all redwood produced in Sweden and Finland has an address in this area. And basically countries we are talking about is Algeria, Morocco, Tunis, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And in 2021, the imports to these countries went down drastically in 2021, and that was driven by three main reasons. The pandemic, of course, that is hurting the consumption, the low oil price, and many of these countries are very much depending on oil, price of oil, and pricing be low, and which means that the state budgets are not the same as they should be then. And also, I think that the rapid price increase of softwood lumber also made it difficult for many customers in this area to finance their business, to get letter of credits in the banks and so on. For 2022, we think that now the stocks in these countries are very low, and we think that it will normalize because prices of lumber are going down and are starting to stabilize at a more reasonable level. The oil price is better, has improved, which means that for a country like Algeria is completely depending on oil, for instance, and lot of the housing, new housing, there's a tremendous need of housing in these countries, but it's also very much the social housing programs very much financed by the states, and then they need oil money, but it looks a little bit more positive. Also, the question mark is, of course, they are still suffering very high from the pandemic. With the exception of Morocco, who has a quite high vaccination rate, the other countries has much lower vaccination rate, and how this will continue when in what level they can increase the vaccination is of course unwritten at this point. But we think that we don't think that the countries as such will be booming, but we think we will have a more even flow of goods to this country, especially in the first half of this year, due to the low stock levels and a little bit more normal activity. US, and I know that Michael is coming back to this. I will hopefully, let's see if he agrees on anything I say, but otherwise he's the expert. But new housing start is showing a slight increase and there are different forecasts on this, but it's showing a slight increase from 2021 levels, and also that the underlying, also that we are coming into figures that is showing that the actual building a little bit over the underlying demand, but it's also been underbuilt for many years. There is a calculation made already. I was attending a conference in Vancouver and had a presentation there, and this bark beetle problem in BC and British Columbia was already on the carpet, and everybody knew that the British Columbia Canadians would have problems, etc., and so on. I think what we didn't know was that it was going to take so long time for the housing market and to recover, and also for the how long you could use the bark beetle logs in production. There is a calculation that when the housing start in US is above some 1.4, then the import need is ticking up. And there are also changes in US housing market that is a little bit is affecting us, is that, and also affecting the R&M sector, is also looking very good in showing rather good figures for next year. Even though you can say that 2021 we felt for a while until the summer it was almost overheated, but we see that the average length of home owners are getting longer, which is, and we see also that it's a movement to the suburban areas caused by this COVID effect, that you are now maybe a little bit more flexible working at home. So new starts looking good and R&M is looking good. When we see with this consumption forecast, we see that US market has a increased dependency on imports. And the Canadian production is only showing a slight decrease for next year, but it's certainly not increasing. But there is an increase in production in US Southeast, but that is not enough to cover this gap. So we think that the flow of goods from Europe to US will remain stable, and even maybe a little bit higher for 2022 than it's been this year. And it will, the thing that might be a constraint is how logistic is developed, and if there are any logistic constraints, which we have at the moment, but also looking rather good. China, very interesting market. And what China have done during the year is that the softwood import to China has dropped with 25% of sawn lumber, equal to 4 or 5 million. And this has been replaced by logs. I will come back to that. And because they have prospered quite a lot, or they have not been able to follow these price peaks that has been in Europe, and they look for cheaper alternatives, and they have been importing enormous amount of logs from Central Europe, these bark beetle damage logs. That is now getting a little bit more difficult, both due to availability of these logs. I mean, they are not endless, and that they are also getting more expensive. So the calculation is different. And Canadian export and US export, I should say, of logs is on a lower level, and that is due to the strong US market. And then there is, by 1st of January, is a Russian log export ban is coming in place, and that it's uncertain if the logs that they have been exporting to China can be converted to lumber, and they also have to be dry lumber and not unseasoned, which has been big flows in the past. So this remains to be seen. We believe that the imports of lumber, when the prices come down and the log prices going the other way, is that we are coming. The need for softwood lumber will increase to China. And here you can say that the imports of, if you look at the imports of log, has been drastically increased during this year, and mainly then from Central Europe as well then from New Zealand. And they have an advantage in China, is that when they are producing this in local sawmills, their yield is very much higher than ours. We would say that we would have 50% yield, they have 80%. And that is due to the fact that they have more labor in the production, and they take care of the wood in another way. They make everything you can imagine on the residues. But here you can see on the top chart here that the price of lumber and the log prices are getting, the margins are getting tighter, and we think that we are reaching a point where it's actually they are switching to lumber again because of the high price of logs, and that the availability is getting less. Then if we look at production, put production against this, then we see that, yeah, production is slightly increasing, but not very much. And basically only in one area, and that is US Southeast, where the British Columbian companies, the Canadian has for many years moved a lot of their operation from Canada or BC down to the southeast of US, where there has been southern yellow pine availabilities. We see Canadian production remains stable, and that is what we think. If it happens something, it might slide downwards a little bit rather than up. Russia is now on a level of 39 million cubic meters. I think the peak was a couple of years ago, they produced 41 million. And we think that they have moderate growth, for maybe they are growing with 1 million cubes next year. Of course, they have a lot of raw material availability in Far East Russia, but it's also in partly remote areas and so on. So it requires infrastructure investments. And the Chinese are very active in Far East Russia. I think there is around 600 sawmills, and 60% are owned by Chinese. So they have a very big influence on this. And I think that the investment will increase with this log export ban. But the lead time is the question is does it have an impact on the business 2022? All the Central European countries are saying that they will be remaining at the same level as 2021. And Austria and Germany, they are at all-time high levels. Germany has increased from 2022 21.2 million up to 27 2021. And of course, this has been driven partly by the excess of logs due to this bark beetle calamity that has been in the area. And they have also exported quite a lot of this. I think it's up to 14 million cubic meters to China this year. And here is a key issue that that log flow has to, I think it need to change, because I can't, it's difficult to see that they can maintain that flow to China at the same time as they're gonna keep these high production levels by themselves. So, and it's a question to also see what kind of raw material availabilities is it in the longer run when after this bark beetle problem it's not going to be solved, but it's going to at least diminish for some part. Finland and Sweden marginally up. There is no major possibility to increase production in Sweden or Finland due to log availability. And also that in Sweden and in Baltic and Finland, the mills are negatively also impacted by this Russian log ban. They are importing logs for the sawmill production, and that those logs will not be available anymore. So in that case, you can see, production is increasing, but we don't see any kind of wall of wood coming from anywhere. If we try to put this together, we try to look at the balance here. And if you look at this light blue bar is 142.5 million. That's the production in Europe, including Russia. And then we have a consumption in Europe of 96.5 million. And then the rest we have to export somewhere. And then we make a prediction of how much is exported from European countries, Sweden, Finland, Germany, to various countries, and also Russia. Sort of say Russia is the biggest exporter to China. They're also quite big exporter to former to the OSS state, Azerbaijan, and these kind of countries. And there's been a big increase in European production if you look at from 2020 to 2021. But it's also been a big consumption increase. I think that China is then predicted is the biggest growth, and it's not so that the consumption might grow with 4 million, but it's a transfer from logs to lumber. And we think that Euro export to US will continue, but it will not explode from the levels we are now. But we think that if you look in during 2021, you have a sliding upgoing trend over the year, and I think it will be more flat. So it will start already in January on a high level. What is to notice here, though, and if we add this together, we can say that demand is slightly higher than the supply. And these bars, when you look at them for 1 year from another, it's not so that there are tens of millions of difference. Normally, a little bit better market or a worse market from our perspective can be, you talk about a 2 or 3 million difference is very, very noticeable, even though the consumption is so high, but there are very small margins. But to take in consideration the difference then, because these numbers looks pretty much as they did last year at this time, but the difference is that at the end of 2020 going into 2021, there was no stock at the mills. And I think that we have a much higher stock in the producer side going into 2021, which will affect, so to say, Q1. There will be a better supplied market Q1, and I think that the prices will then be more stable from the levels that we now see has developed in Q4, while I think from Q2 and onwards, you can see another scenario. If I then try to conclude is that market balance in good shape, but higher stocks. And I think that consumption is looking very good 2022, and it is affected still by enormous amount of money put into the system. Good outlook in US. The worrying thing in US is that the inflation rates, and if that is leading to higher interest and so on, and that will then affect the building start. Michael probably can enlighten us a little bit more about that. That is a worrying part. We think that mainland China returns to more normal volumes than last year, without saying that they will in peaking anyway. And I think that the lower prices, the downturn in prices are the main driver for that. No significant increase in production. And what is, however, a big issue here is the logistic calamity that we see. So we have a very, during the pandemic, the whole world had changed their purchase pattern. So consumer has been ordering online from home and actually been buying a lot, but they haven't spent their money on traveling and restaurant services and so on. And this has changed logistics quite a lot. And we see a big calamity that together with the pandemic. So we see that there are to certain areas, and these logistic chains are so tight and build up in just in time. So slight disturbances is causing a lot of problem. So I think that at the moment we see that there is for our point of view, it's the possibilities to do what we want to do is to a high extent depending on our ability to have reasonable logistics. And the freights are very high. So we have problems, we have a shortage of containers to Asia, and we also see that there are limited capacity to US, and there's congestions in port, both in China and both in US due to both pandemic and other reasons. So this is a kind of unknown factor at the moment, how this will shape the market. I just want to end with saying that what is also noticeable, very noticeable, is that wood is gaining significant shares from other materials and in building activity. So we are now looking at a CLT consumption of 2 million in Europe. It was, go back 10 years, was 500,000, and the expectation when you read the global expectation, because CLT is also starting to gain a lot of ground in the US, is that this will grow very fast and will be a big wood consumer going forward. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Ollie. That was fantastic insight into the outlook for the softwood sector. And I think we're going to come back to quite a few of those questions, particularly the points you raised at the end about the market share for timber products, taking market share from other sectors. I think it's something that's definitely happening, and it's something that's certainly a big topic of conversation within our committees and groups and a lot of the other events that we've been running over the past few months, actually. So, no, thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to say to the audience, please do keep your questions coming in. Use either the Q&A or the chat function. Questions about anything you hear or anything else you want to raise on the subject of global timber supply. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Ollie. I will now introduce our next speaker, coming over from the other side of the world and indeed the other side of the market to look at hardwood outputs. I'd like to introduce Michael Snow, the Executive Director of the American Hardwood Export Council. Mike, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, David. Let me make sure I can get this up. Okay, I'm assuming everybody can see that. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's timely indeed, and it's been interesting listening to the last couple of presentations. Do want to make one quick clarification. I know when Ali was talking before, primarily in softwoods, about the U.S. being import dependent. We have the exact opposite issue when it comes to hardwoods, which is of course where AHEC is involved. We are more than self-dependent in hardwoods, and we have quite a bit of capacity to export as well. And what I wanted to do really is kind of take a sort of a historical view on where supplies are now and where consumption is, both in the US, but also in the overseas markets, because we've seen a lot of changes in the last few years. The hardwood sector for the United States, for those of you that aren't completely familiar with it, is essentially the Mississippi River to the west. I'm sorry, to the east is where the vast majority of the hardwoods come from. And unlike in a lot of other areas, it's not plantations. We plant very little. We'll get into that a little bit later. But essentially, the hardwood forest cover in the United States is essentially equivalent to France, Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands all put together. And that's just the standing timber in the hardwood forest in the United States. That doesn't include the big western softwood forests. If we take a look at where supply has been in the US, where production of hardwoods been in the US, it's kind of interesting. The high water mark was way back in 1999. And as you see, production took a huge plunge with the Great Recession about a decade ago. Started climbing back a little bit, but almost all of that on the back of exports, which is what I'm going to get into in a second. If we go back to 1999 and we look at where grade lumber coming off the sawmills went, back in 1999, 84% of the grade lumber we produced was consumed domestically here in the United States. Exports were about 16%, less than 1% exports to China. If we go up to the trade war in 2018, then suddenly the domestic market is taking up now just over half. China, 26%. In other words, before the trade war started in late 2018, 1 out of every 4 grade boards of US hardwood lumber that was produced were ending up in China, with the rest of the world combined at about 19%. Obviously, we've seen the risks involved with having so many eggs in one basket. But the reason that we've seen this big drop here really has been the offshoring of most of the industries in the US that use hardwood. Again, we're not talking construction, we're talking by and large the decorative woods. We look at the US furniture industry, high water mark in 1999, 2020, ended up way down there. Same thing, the US cabinet industry. Between 1999, again, high water mark, grew a little bit, but then this big drop off as we began to see more and more cabinets and kitchen cabinets, bathroom cabinets, and so forth imported as well. Molding and millwork, much the same story, not surprisingly. And the solid wood flooring industry, again, much of the same story. So what we've seen really is our industry really depending on exports, not just for the leftovers, but really on exports as one of the main drivers of production. And again, if we looked where production peaked in 1999, these were our exports going back. AHEC was founded in 1986. And then we saw, again, the Great Recession. And then this huge growth here was largely attributed to exports to China. If you can see the kind of the shape of this growth in that sort of 10-year period, very similar to this, which is our exports to China, topping off at the end of 2017. We saw a drop in 2018 because of the trade war in the second half, 2019, full tariffs, and then by 2020, we added COVID to the mix, and we've really seen a very significant drop off in exports. And in fact, if we look pre-trade war, to the end of the first year of the trade war, 1999, so before COVID, essentially the volume of lumber that we lost to China, 335 million board feet is how much we lost in exports to China in that 1 year period due to the 25% retaliatory tariffs the Chinese put on. That 335 million lost to China is actually more than our entire exports to the next two biggest markets combined, which are the European Union and Vietnam. So obviously this was something that was felt widely across the industry. And it's really not just the trade war that the US exports to China. I don't want to get into a lot of details on China, but they're having some significant challenges, particularly in the property industry. I think we're going to see further declines. But if you look at China's overall exports between 2018 before the trade war and 2020, it's not just this reduction from the United States. I mean, we're looking at the United States obviously having a smaller market share, but a smaller market share of a much smaller pie moving forward, which obviously makes finding new markets and expanding new markets more important. So what has it been looking like? And I'm using in here all 9 months. So these are January to September going back. 2021 so far has been a good year. In fact, we're above the pre-COVID year of 2019. So we've recovered from there. We still haven't recovered from the tariff war and really the loss of significant market share as well as volumes into China. Nevertheless, China is, again, this is again 6 months, 2021, China does still remain the largest market for us. Followed by Canada. The US and Canadian markets are very integrated when it comes to hardwood lumber. There's a lot of cross-border, so we really look at Vietnam, Mexico, the UK, Japan as being the next markets. In fact, if we take China and Canada out, this is what the rest of the world looks like as far as our things. And as you can see, 2021 has been very good almost across the board. A big jump in Mexico, a nice big jump to the UK. A healthy jump to Japan, Germany up, Indonesia up, Italy up a little bit, South Korea. Really the outlier has been Spain in 21 after actually ticking up a little bit during the COVID year of 20. One of the things when we talk about, again, and there's a lot of discussions about planting and so forth of trees. And again, I want to make it clear that the hardwood industry in the United States really does not plant trees. It's natural generation and what they call selective harvesting, or essentially they'll go in, remove certain trees, leave the rest standing, and allow the forest that way to to continue to regenerate itself. Let nature determine what species come up. But in order for that to work, it's very important to do that from a sustainability perspective. There has to be a market for what the forest provides. And I think this is where sometimes that kind of gets lost in the picture. We look at one thing, red oak. Prior to the trade war, red oak is by far the most abundant species in the US forest. Yet in 2017, 2018, about 80% of our red oak exports were going to China. So when China, with the trade war, when China stopped buying, red oak took an enormous hit to its demand. And that's a problem because, as I mentioned, that is the single most single most abundant species in the U.S. hardwood forest. And, it's not just a question of using the species that nature provides, but also using as much of the tree as possible. And I think another thing we need to see when we communicate with designers and architects and so forth is take a look at some of the lower grade wood, some of those character marks and so forth. Use the natural part of the wood. I mean, that's what separates wood from the other materials. And you said it before, if you want every piece to look equal, if you want it to look like plastic, then you might as well use plastic. If you're going to use wood, embrace those character marks, embrace those color variations and the natural things that make wood wood. If we take a look at Europe, we've got a couple of very good stories here. 2021, we've actually surpassed any previous year through 9 months. It's looking very, very good, even with, as people are well aware, with supply chain issues, and there's been bottlenecks, and some of that have resulted in fairly high prices historically. But again, we're still seeing tremendous growth, and as we see, the UK is and remains the biggest market that we have in Europe. And as I know David Venables, our director, points out, what really makes it interesting is the UK is all of this volume really is demand from the small bespoke furniture manufacturers. There's an awful lot of them in the UK. It's not the big major flooring mills or big major furniture factories, which I think also from a sustainability perspective is very, very good, because they do tend to buy a wider variety of species. And as I talked about the red oak, this is where I think we've seen some real changes in the last few years, because it wasn't that long ago where red oak basically couldn't give it away in Europe. We had a rather famous exchange at a hardwood convention several years ago when a German importer, who shall remain nameless, told us to stop beating the dead horse of red oak. We don't want it. We're never going to want it. So you keep it. I think we can see that that's beginning to change, and we are seeing substantial growth in red oak exports into Europe. So let's get back to starting talking about supply. I think it's interesting to keep in mind that even here, if we look at 2019, when our production was at its highest in 2019, threw this one in here just to show you the last quarter, the last half a year in particular. We are starting to see production ramp back up now. From where it was, still historically extremely low, but it is beginning to ramp back up. But if you remember that, 1999, when we had the high mark, look at what happened in those years before that. This is standing timber in the U.S. forest, in the U.S. hardwood forest. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the U.S. Forest Service runs every 4 years. They call the Forest Industry and Analysis, where they go in both through satellites and through on-the-ground sampling, and they take inventories. We have seen the standing timber in the U.S. hardwood forest more than double between 1953 and 2017, 2018. So it's, even back when we had production at its all-time high, we were still seeing growth in the standing timber. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind, because we can ramp back up. If we go back to this one, we can ramp production up by 2, 3, maybe even 4 times where it is right now, and still have net growth in the forests. So if we're looking at, are there enough trees in the forest? The answer, at least from the North American hardwood perspective, is absolutely yes. The one thing about the forest inventory and analysis data, it's fantastic information. It's very detailed information, but unfortunately, it always came out as about 800 pages of Excel spreadsheets that were very, very difficult to get your head around. So again, David Venables and his team in London came up with a way to take all of that information and turn it into an interactive map, which is going to allow people, whether they're architects or whether they're traders and they're interested in specific species or in the overall, they can go in on our website, and you can either look at all of the standing timbers, or you can look at red oak for the whole mainland US, or you can go state by state. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to look at over the last four-year period, what the growth was, what the removals and mortality were for each individual species. This is tulipwood, yellow poplar, for the removals for that, the net growth for that, and again, the total volume of timber in that. So this is something that's been very, very useful in discussions with architects and, in discussions with designers and customers that really want to know, if I'm bringing in tulip wood from the United States, what is the supply situation like? Is it, are we cutting too much of it? And, we have all of this information at our fingertips. And really, if you go into that website, it gives you a lot more information as well, as well as the life cycle information. But this one, I think, is really interesting and has really stuck with architects and designers. Essentially, what this does is this gives you the renewal rate. So with our growth to removals nationally for red oak, for example, for every cubic meter of red oak that's harvested, essentially with the growing stock, it takes 1.75 seconds, less than 2 seconds, so less than the time the slide has been up, for that cubic meter of red oak to have already been replaced in the forest. And I think those kind of numbers, when architects and end users are used to hearing things about, how many football fields a second of forests are disappearing in the tropics, we actually have a situation where it's exactly the opposite when we look in North America. And I wanted to keep this short and let the time for the discussion. So I think I will end with that. And I apologize for speaking quickly. It's something I've worked on my whole life and just haven't seemed to be able to kick the habit. But again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. No need to apologize at all. There was some incredible information in there, and some really, really good facts and figures, particularly about the demand for timber leading to the growth of forests. And I think that that's a key point that we've got to come back to, and where that demand comes from and how that demand is made up. And I know that there's been some questions that have come up around those topics already just while you were talking, and we'll address them when we come to the Q&A session at the end. But in the meantime, thank you very much. If I can ask you to stop sharing your screen.
That's what there we go.
Okay, thanks very much.
It was frozen on me there. So.
No problem. Okay, well, thank you very much. And so our final speaker today, before we get into some of the Q&A and discussion, and I would just remind everyone in the audience, just send in your questions, bung them in the Q&A or in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. I would like to invite up and introduce Rupert Oliver from Forest Industries Intelligence. We've just heard a presentation from the UK, from the EU perspective, from a US hardwoods perspective. So no pressure at all, Rupert. Your title is the rest of the world. So if I can ask you to put your presentation up. Yeah, we've got it. Yeah, we've got it. Thank you very much, Rupert. Over to you.
And you can probably see I have very unsubtly changed the title to tropical timbers, because I thought that was the one area that hadn't really been covered yet. And also, I just wanted to say that I'll probably be looking less at the sort of immediate economic situation, and looking, when you're dealing with the tropical forest sector, often the quality of data is rather low. So some of the commentary is probably a little bit more speculative. I look in awe at some of the data provided by the earlier speakers, at the level of production, for example, the level of consumption. When you're dealing with the tropical sector, you can't get that level of detail often. So I will give a sort of 20,000 foot review of the tropical timber market in particularly last year, how that developed last year. But I also want to show you the results of a new study from ITTO, looking actually ahead to the next 30 years on how the global supply and demand for tropical timbers might develop. But before I do that, I just wanted to put this up because I think it raises some quite important issues from the perspective of the topic for today, which is actually looking obviously at global wood supply. And there's quite a lot of lessons, I think, from this quote and this set of maps here, which was produced a couple of years ago. It came from Nature, obviously the very well-renowned scientific journal. And it was a study looking at global land change between 1982 to 2016, looking at worldwide satellite data. It's probably the most comprehensive study of this type ever undertaken. And the key conclusion is quoted there. Contrary to the prevailing view that forest area has declined globally, tree cover has increased by 2.24 million kilometers squared. That's 7.71%, sorry, relative to the 1982 level. So I think that might surprise a lot of people. Tree cover actually has increased over that period. And there was a net loss in the tropics, certainly, which was outweighed by a net gain in the extratropics. Now, of course, we are talking here not about deforestation, but about changes in tree cover. It's a subtly different concept. And of course, the trees that are now covering the world's land area, they're very different type of trees from 40 years ago. They tend to be a lot smaller, a wide variety of early successional species where there's been natural regeneration. You might have large areas of monocultures where there's been planting. For example, in China, vast millions of hectares have been covered with just one type of poplar species, very limited genome with that particular species, but it covers millions of hectares in China. We're talking about trees generally that are seen as lower value from a commercial perspective than perhaps 40 years ago. We don't have these large trees that could be converted into plywood very cheaply. A lot of these species, these trees, the larger trees in the tropics, they were systematically mined effectively for 30 or 40 years. There was a lot of high grading of lumber exploitation over those years. So we have a generally lower quality from a forestry perspective, from a commercial forestry perspective. We have a generally lower value timber resource over large areas of the world. But there's no shortage of fiber. I think this research demonstrates that there's actually no real shortage of fiber at a global level. And in industrialized nations, of course, in China, parts of Asia, industry, the processing sector has evolved to cope with smaller trees, to produce very valuable products from smaller dimension materials, producing all sorts of panel products, of course, using new types of surfaces and that sort of thing. So there has been an increase in the availability of fiber, evolution, innovative processing to produce new, higher quality products from that fiber. But that hasn't happened all over the world, of course. There are parts, particularly in the tropics, sub-Saharan Africa, of course, where they also have quite a lot of fiber available, lower quality fiber, but there hasn't been the investment in new processing capacity. There's a lot of risks associated with, obviously, installing capacity in those countries. So there is, although there's a lot of fiber, a lot of it isn't being used effectively. In fact, if you look at this, the satellite imagery, particularly the lower picture, which shows the change in forest, in tree cover over the last 40 years, you'll see even in the tropics, although there's been a loss of tree cover in that area, even in the tropics, it's a very nuanced picture. If you look, there are areas of green there, which are where tree cover has increased in some particularly surprising areas. For example, in West Africa, a zone sort of in the immediate sub-Saharan region there has been quite a lot of tree cover gain in that area, and that is where a lot of farmers who were previously cultivating the land, they moved off the land, and actually in that area there is quite a lot of regeneration of these what would be called degraded forests, secondary forests, naturally regenerating forests, which are, from a forestry perspective, tend to be quite low value timber, but there's a lot of fiber there. And a big question for tropical timber supply long term, or wood fiber supply in the tropics, is what is going to happen to this secondary forest, to this naturally regenerating degraded forest? What is the future of that? Is it going to be converted to plantations over the long term? Is it going to be allowed to rewild? and become a new source of area for biodiversity? Is it going to be converted over to more intensive commercial agriculture? These are all, I don't know the answers to those questions. They're big open questions, and they have a big bearing on the long-term future of supply from the tropical timber regions. So that was just an introductory comment, really. I think what I want to do now is briefly look at the current situation in the tropical timber world. And this is relying on two studies that have been produced recently, very good quality studies from the International Tropical Timber Organization. First, their biennial review and assessment of the world timber situation, which obviously they produce every 2 years. The most recent one was published near the beginning of this year. I'll show you a few of the slides and highlight a few of the things that have come out of that, give a sort of 20,000 foot overview of the tropical timber trade during that period. And then I want to talk briefly to this Tropical Timber 2050 report, a technical series report, which uses an economic model to assess what where the tropical timber industry and supply situation will be over the next 30 years or so. So this is just from the biennial review. Then we know from that, the research that was done for that report, that the total tropical industrial roundwood production last year was around 330 million cubic meters, which was 3%, only 3% less than the previous year. This is quite a surprising result. I think earlier in the year, due to the pandemic, there was an expectation that the decline would be a lot higher than that. But the estimate is only a 3% decline in 2020. And the tropical world accounted for around 17% of world total industrial roundwood production last year. Now, one thing, putting this data up here, one thing to highlight is actually, to some extent, it shows the real problems with the quality of data in the tropical world. It's one of my pet subjects, the extraordinarily low quality of the data on tropical log production. Even the legitimate production, we don't have good quality data of, let alone the illegal production. Even the legal production, we do not know the exact volumes of wood being produced in many countries, even despite all the work that's been done on timber legality assurance systems, despite all the work that's been done on REDD schemes, despite all those efforts and the availability of satellite data and that sort of thing, there's still relatively low quality data on the volume of tropical log production. Just another thing to highlight from this data, we've got the major tropical log producers there listed. All the major tropical log producers these days, they're all actually heavily dependent on plantations, not on natural forest timbers at all. Even Indonesia, of course, which is listed there as the largest producer of logs, tropical logs in the world. On the right-hand side, you can see where most of that log supply comes from. The natural forest concessions and forest conversion, which about 10 years ago were providing quite a large share of production, something like 50%. 10 years ago, that share has dropped considerably and now it's only about 8 or 9% derives from natural forest concessions. And the big increase in Indonesia, as in other parts of the tropical world, has been in plantation production. If you look down the list again, you can see India's second on that list, and you can see that there's actually been recorded very little change in log production in India, and that's because in India, effectively, there's no good quality data on log production there, and actually that figure for Indian production hasn't changed for about 30 years. So it's a really inaccurate picture of the situation there. Moving on, I just want to look at the major trade flows for tropical industrial roundwood last year. And the obvious picture here, the most immediate thing that jumps out from this particular slide is the central role of China. In fact, China, when it comes to the tropical log trade now, it really is the only only game in town. It completely dominates tropical log consumption worldwide. The biggest supplier of tropical logs to China last year, as it has been for several years, was Papua New Guinea. The Solomon Islands was the second biggest supplier, and these two countries have been supplying logs to China and have been the dominant suppliers now for some considerable length of time. India was formerly a large importer of logs, obviously of teak logs from Myanmar, but now that the Myanmar resource has been particularly devastated over the years, has been overexploited, that trade and Myanmar has ceased the export of logs. That trade has now stopped with India, and India has become reliant on imports more of plantation teak from a variety of sources. In fact, it's had to shift to some extent to importing more sawn timber than in the past. Malaysia is actually now the largest supplier of logs into India, but that trade has been drastically reducing over the years. Vietnam has emerged as a more important importer of tropical logs in recent years, much of this coming actually from Cameroon. If we look at the figures on the two charts, you can see that last year there was quite a substantial drop, obviously due to the pandemic, in the log trade to both China and to other countries. This is looking at the tropical sawnwood trade last year. A number of things to highlight again. Again, China is by far the dominant importer of tropical sawnwood. Thailand, of course, jumps out at you. The huge volumes of sawnwood exported from Thailand into China. Now, this is all, of course, rubber wood. And I understand there's actually quite a significant volume of rubber still available. So it's a very large trade, but that volume is likely to be sustained into the long term of rubber wood from redundant rubber plantations. Elsewhere, important trade flows of sawnwood into China. Brazil has been supplying a large quantity of tropical sawnwood into China in recent years. Thailand, other than Thailand, Malaysia, of course, was for a long time the largest exporter of other types of tropical sawnwood, but a lot of the exports from Malaysia have tended to be declining in recent years as Malaysia has been moving up the value chain and producing more furniture and exporting more value-added products in recent years. Again, one of the things that features here is you would expect, I think, the EU to be a more important market for tropical sawnwood. Of course, it was until about 10 years ago, but over the years, the volumes have declined quite considerably. The EU and the UK now is very much dependent on sawnwood from just two African countries, Cameroon and Gabon, the only countries that feature on there. A lot of it now is being funneled through Belgium. I mean, the EUTR seems to have had quite a significant impact in concentrating imports of tropical sawnwood through a more limited number of larger importers into the EU. Supplies from Gabon are tending to increase slightly. Cameroon is now by far the largest exporter of sawnwood into the EU. But at the same time, there's a bit more rising, which isn't shown on here. There is a general increase in imports from the Congo Republic, which has become a slightly more important supplier to the European market in recent times. Looking at the tropical plywood trade, a few things just to highlight here. Indonesia is still by far the largest exporter of tropical plywood around the world. It's not incidentally the largest producer of tropical plywood in the world. That accolade must go to China. China is actually quite some significant margin the largest producer of plywood with a tropical hardwood face. Most of that is used domestically in China. Indonesia is the largest exporter of tropical hardwood plywood around the world, with most of that destined for the USA, for Japan, and for Korea. That trade, which was rising quite sharply until about 3 years ago, did decline. Even before the pandemic, the trade in plywood was big oversupply of plywood into the world market in 2018, and after that in 2019 with the problems of the trade dispute between the US and China and other problems with international trade at that time, cooling global economy, the plywood trade did decline quite sharply in 2019 and then declined even more sharply in 2020. Another couple of things to emphasize here. Yes, Vietnam has been becoming an increasingly important supplier of plywood, particularly into the United States over the last couple of years. Malaysia, again, was formerly one of the largest suppliers, but again, the level of supply of tropical hardwood plywood out of Malaysia has been tending to decline with problems with the availability of log supply. Most of Malaysia's plywood is destined for Japan. Brazil, formerly a very large exporter of tropical hardwood plywood, but until about 20 years ago, but that volume now is very much restricted. And then just looking at major trade flows in wooden furniture, which is now a very important component of exports, wood products exports from tropical countries, particularly, of course, in Southeast Asia. The big trend here, of course, has been a very rapid rise in exports from Vietnam over recent years, which was accelerated due to the US-China trade dispute. Although China is still exporting quite a lot of wood furniture to the USA, that volume has been declining quite rapidly in the last couple of years. You can see on that chart on the top right there, that's showing China exports of wooden furniture by the importing country. And it shows that the USA, of course, very sharp increase until 2018. But then because of the trade dispute, the value of exports from China to the US fell by about $4 billion in the period of 2 years. That loss of share from China has been almost entirely taken up by Vietnam. And in fact, Vietnam's exports of wooden furniture have been rising at a rate of over 1 billion per year in the last 4 or 5 years. And in fact, this year, the value of exports from Vietnam to the USA of wooden furniture really accelerated again. I think it went up about $2 billion this year alone. So a very rapid change in the trade, a very sharp change in the structure of the world wood furniture trade. The EU 28, you can see from here, has generally been a less important export market, both for tropical furniture and for furniture from China. And that's because unlike the US, China does have a very dominant Europe obviously does have a very dominant domestic furniture sector, which still accounts for something like 80 or 90% of total wood furniture consumption in Europe comes from domestic producers. And although there has been a shift to lower cost production areas within Europe, particularly a big development in manufacturing of wood furniture into Eastern Europe, with some decline in more traditional supply countries such as particularly Italy and Spain. A lot of the movement in the wood furniture sector in Europe has been to other European countries and been less dependent on Southeast Asia and China for supply. Now, just turning to look briefly at the longer term prospects for tropical timber to 2050, drawing on this ITTO Technical Series Report 49. Again, it's on the ITTO website, freely available, very good quality report. I'll just very briefly run through some of the key results from this. It is based on an economic model which forecasts worldwide production, consumption, and trade of forest products. Based on a set of scenarios. The report draws on what they termed a middle of the road scenario, looking at some of the assumptions are listed there, that there will be, over the long term, a gradual increase in GDP and population, leading to an overall increase in demand for and trade of forest products. They speculate that there will be future wood fuel demand, which will actually decrease due to technology changes, although I'm slightly skeptical about that particular assumption, given the huge increase in demand for biomass just at the moment. That they also assume that agricultural land expansion will continue at the expense of natural forests over the long term, and that plantations will be the main source of wood, which will increase at a relatively at a slower pace. And they also assume that payments for forest carbon sequestration via afforestation and avoided deforestation will be priced from around 2030 onwards. At the moment, there's not a lot of income that can be derived by forest producers from ecosystem services, but they're assuming that this will gradually change from about 2030 onwards. Now, just to run through very quickly the results of this modeling exercise. This is the scope of the model. It covers roundwood, which is including both the production of wood fuel and industrial roundwood, which itself produces sawnwood, veneer, and plywood, particle fiberboard, and wood pulp. And just looking at the overall results, it indicates that in 2050, the projection is that tropical roundwood production will decrease by about 13% compared to 2015, to about 1.25 billion meters cubed, and that the tropical world contribution to global production will also decrease quite sharply from about 29% to 38%. It shows that the wood fuel, a big part of the decline in roundwood production, will be due to a fall in global production of wood fuel by about 29% to 719 million cubic meters by 2050, and that the production of wood fuel in the tropics will account at that stage for around 50% of global production, compared to 55% in 2015. The industrial roundwood side of things, the one that we're particularly interested in from a commercial forestry perspective, it indicates that actually in the tropics, the expectation is that the industrial roundwood will increase, the production will increase by about 24% to 534 million meters cubed, and that the tropical world in 2050 will account for around 19% of global production, compared to 22% in 2015. A big change here will be the continuous increase in dependence on plantations. Currently stands at about 60% of industrial roundwood production in the tropics currently comes from plantations. The expectation is that will rise to nearly 3/4 of all production from plantations by 2050. Sawnwood, veneer, and plywood, again, there will be an increase in production in the tropics to 2050, quite a big increase, in fact, by about 68% to nearly 300 million meters cubed. And the tropics in 2050 is expected to account for about 15% of global production, which will be the same percentage as in 2015. So there is an expectation that in terms of sawnwood, veneer, and plywood, the tropical world will retain its current level of significance. Looking at particle board, fiberboard, and wood pulp, again, given the expected rise in plantation production, it's no surprise here to see that certainly the panel production is expected to increase in the tropics. In fact, it's expected to increase by nearly 100% over the next 30 years to 69 million meters cubed, but it will still remain a relatively small proportion of overall global production, only 8%, in fact, lower percentage than today, which is currently 10% of panels production worldwide currently comes from the tropics. And pulp, again, the tropics is not expected to become a significant supplier of pulp. Most pulp plantations are expected to remain in extratropical regions, And in fact, overall, the level of pulp production in the tropics is expected to drop, according to this model, by about 20% to only around 110 million meters cubed. And the proportion of pulp coming from the tropical world will fall from 20% currently to about 14% in 2050. So very much a mixed picture overall. The story is that the tropical world, although there will be increases in production in the tropics, the share of the tropical countries in overall global wood supply is expected to change. And I also want to just highlight one other thing from that particular report, which is the extent to which the tropical countries are expected to account for global consumption of wood products. And although the world population in those regions is going to increase very rapidly and will increase to around 38% of the world's population by 2050, it's still expected that by 2050, the tropical countries will still only account for around 12% of global wood consumption, which is actually a big problem for the tropical timber industry for the reasons cited in the report. It's a low domestic market demand in the tropical producer regions will constrain wood industry development by deterring investments in modern capital-intensive wood processing industries. And of course, if you've got a lot of population growth, you'll have a lot of urbanization in tropical countries. So if they're not using the wood, what are they going to be using? Of course, they'll be using a lot of high energy materials. At present, there's a heavy reliance on concrete as a material. So not using the wood from the tropical countries for their own local urban developments is going to lead, in fact, to an increase in carbon intensity in a lot of these countries. It is really a very significant missed opportunity. So just some concluding comments. Just going back to the question I raised at the beginning of my presentation, what will be the fate of the area of degraded tropical forest, which actually is a very large area of forest. It's something like 500 million hectares, which is greater than the entire area of the EU and the UK combined. What's going to happen to this area? We simply do not know on a large scale. It's somewhere where we need to do a lot more analysis to understand what's going to happen to it. A lot of policy initiatives will have quite a big impact on this. Will it be converted mainly to agriculture? Will it be converted to intensive timber plantations? Or are we going to see some sort of process of rewilding in the tropics? A lot of these forests actually, although they're seen from a commercial perspective as degraded and as low value, they actually have quite a high quite a high contribution to biodiversity conservation, and also they are now sequestering quite a lot of carbon. So what's going to happen to those? Generally speaking, for the tropical world, there is a considerable need to enhance forest inventory and production data. As I mentioned at the start, a lot of the data is extremely low quality. We don't even know the starting point at this stage. How to develop the forest industry in these countries. We need a lot more better quality data on the area and quality of the forests. Forest governance, of course, absolutely imperative. I've heard Dave Hopkins mention a few times that everything else stems from good forest governance. I think he's right. There is this need to be continually focusing on tenure reform, on setting out clear rights and responsibilities, engaging with local communities and other stakeholders through processes that have been initiated very effectively by the EU and the UK. The FLEGT VPA processes have been very effective in bringing together a lot of stakeholders and engaging in forest sector reform. These initiatives need to be built on for the long term. And of course, there is this need to bring in a lot of the innovations in processing, in the development of products. A lot of these innovations which have been made in industrialized nations, there needs to be technology transfer to tropical countries, particularly for enhanced use of small dimension materials and for using diverse non-traditional species. Obviously, a lot more efforts need to be focused on marketing, both to increase not only exports, but to increase domestic utilization, where again, as I emphasized before, there is a big opportunity there for tropical timbers and for improved utilization of the product, and also for avoiding use of higher energy intensity substitute materials. And of course, ultimately, there's a need for a much greater investment and capital for startups and SMEs, particularly in tropical countries, very highly fragmented industry there, a lot of risks associated. And one of the things that has been a real challenge for the tropical timber producers at present, and which is likely to continue, has been this lack of real investment in the development of modern industries there. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rupert. That was fantastic to see the reality of so many different trade flows out of the tropics and where they're going and what they're being used for. It's an incredible bit of work, good bit of research that you've done there to see all of those things. And I think I will ask all of our speakers, actually, if you could just switch your cameras back on and come off mute. I'm just going to start. I think we've got quite a lot of questions that have come in, and I will ask our audience once again, if you've got any further questions, do wing them through. But I want to start off. We were looking at the reality of global timber supply. We've been asked a lot of questions about, have we got enough wood? So I just wanted to start with just a recap on some of the points that came up actually in your presentation, Rupert, and in Mike's, and in Ollie's and elsewhere. So since 1990, forest cover has grown actually in the EU and in the USA, whilst the timber industry has also grown. So the value of that and the volumes coming out have grown. Can that trend continue? We saw in Ollie's presentation that demand was going to outstrip supply in terms of capacity, but can that trend of growing forests whilst growing the timber industry, can you see that continuing over the next few years or into the future? And anyone can answer.
Well, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't mind briefly saying yes. I mean, my knowledge of the resources certainly is yes. I don't see why not. Why can't it continue to expand? The forests in both regions are increasing. In many parts, certainly in the States and in Europe, the actual level of harvest is still significantly below the level of growth. And there's a lot of areas in parts of both in North America and in Eastern Europe where we are seeing quite a lot of expansion of forest. In Eastern Europe, for example, a lot of new forests are being established through natural regeneration, as they have been in the hardwood producing areas. So, I mean, my view is absolutely we can see growth.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think the supply is getting tighter, but in 1960 there was a conference, in Rome, where they invited all possible smartest researchers on different areas, and they tried to predict when different raw materials would run out. And according to them, then, for instance, oil would be out in the early 80s. There will be no more oil because it was a linear calculation. Of course, the car then was 3 liters per mile, and now it's 0.3. So first of all, I think that we will have to. First of all, the technique is increasing all the time. So I think that the way what we use, how we use the material, how we take care of it, and so on, will make more availability as such. That's one thing. What is maybe a bigger issue, and as said here in Sweden, it's growing far more than we are harvesting, and the growth the last since World War II or 1940s and so on is tremendous. And we got our first forest management law in 1542. So we certainly take care of forest. The issue is, I think, the debate of how forests going to be used. So here in Sweden, there's a big debate on whether on one side you shouldn't cut, you should leave the forest due to CO2 emissions, and of course we mean that you cannot, you actually will ruin, you will lower the CO2, you will increase the CO2 emissions if you don't manage the forest and you don't use it as wood and so on. And that debate is very emotional, and maybe not as fact-based as you would like. And I see that as a big threat, how we are, I completely agree with Stuart that we will be better, we will, technique will be better, we will have other, how can we increase the growth rates, I mean, per year and so on, and that will develop. But how are we politically?
Yes.
I think this is a big issue, and that is also much more unpredictable.
Yeah,
and it's very emotional.
It is, and it relies on a lot of communication and ingrained perception amongst the audience. Stuart,
Yes.
Stuart, if I can then turn to you on that. We've said, you know, there's no reason why the forest can't keep growing in the EU and across the US. What can we do in the UK? And so I guess it's specifically England. Scotland has a good forest cover, and the relationship with the forests is much more productive because of the base there. What can we do, and indeed, what are you doing now in England? I mean, I know you're doing a lot of work. What can we do to change that in England?
Well, I mean, it's a two-part thing for me, because in England there is actually also a lot of woodland there already. It's just, it's never been properly managed for a long time, and we've lost a lot of the quality hardwoods, for example, that are there. You know, we've got companies that currently do what they can with the existing resource and produce fantastic hardwood products, but we're not managing them in order to be able to produce that quality outcome, and that's something we need to change. But the other part of it, I saw in the questions, there was a thing in there about, can we achieve 17% forestry cover in the UK by 2050? You know, what are the challenges? And the big challenge is that we need to convert land, and land at the moment that we'd be looking to, you know, to do that on would be agricultural land. And the people who own that land, work on that land, need to make an income.
Yeah.
And in England, we're not grasping the thorny issue of how can we plant more woodland, but also then provide an income for the people who are managing that land. And, you know, the solution is to make it pay, you know, by producing products. So it's, you know, the point you said about communication is absolutely key to all of this, because the answers are there in front of us. It's just that people's perceptions are, and the lack of connection with forestry and managing is gone.
Yes.
And, you know, there's a danger that you know, that's not going to change anytime soon. So we need to have governments taking a lead and be prepared to explain, you know, supported by the sector.
Yeah, I like the photo you put up, the slide you put up about the New Forest, particularly as Chris Packham lives there, who was criticising that. I live opposite a sign that says "Welcome to Epping Forest," and there's hardly a tree in sight. It's just a big, flat green area. So I do think that we need to challenge a lot of those perceptions about woodland and productive forestry, certainly. I wanted to ask everybody actually on the panel about bugs and pests. And one of the things with climate change, and Ollie has touched on this quite a lot already in your presentation when it came to the bark beetle. Now that's something we can expect, or bugs in general, beetles and other pests, we can expect a lot more of. Is that changing the way that you look at forests, look at forest management? We've seen a lot of areas taken out of production across Europe. And so, Mike, I'm gonna come to you first, if I can. US hardwoods, you said it's natural regeneration. So, is that not a consideration, or is it something that's still high on people's minds?
No, it's definitely a consideration, and I think part of the problem is we're just kind of right now at the tip of the iceberg on what climate change is going to mean for the forest.
Yeah.
But when we look at things like pests, I mean, that's been an ongoing concern in the United States. We essentially lost in the 1970s our elm resource to Dutch elm disease. We're right now in the midst of our ash being devastated by the emerald ash borer, and ash is a tree that in the United States has a very emotional connection to people, because that's what we make our baseball bats out of is ash. It would be like losing all your willow, I guess, for cricketers. But changes in temperatures and changes in rainfall. I mean, we're seeing more and more. It's been much more of an issue on the West Coast, which is largely softwood. But we've got these long periods of drought, followed by a deluge, and as these things become more and more the norm, I think we're just at the very beginning of understanding what the long-term pressures are going to be.
Yeah. Okay. Ollie, if I can ask you, I don't know if this comes into your thinking a lot, but the spread and rise of pests and bugs and beetles and what have you, is that a consideration when you look forward at the availability of wood?
Let's put it this way. I think it's a great concern, and I think that it will change. There's already a lot of research and a lot of activities going on. What kind of species should you plant in the future? How can you plant them in order to build, I don't know, corridors so the bugs cannot treat? But it's not only this bark beetle. It's also that how do you? I think it's a fact that it gets warmer, and it's also has a tendency to we have more wind, more storms, etc. And so on. What kind of species are? I mean, why Central Europe are so affected now is, of course, they have slightly warmer. We are still in a little bit colder climate, but it's because everything that was planted after World War II was spruce. Our forest is more mixed, so then we are not suffering as much. But I think all of this is it's a great concern, and I think that there's a lot of research and a lot of tests how you can catch these bugs in an early phase and so on. And I think this is something. The only thing we know, there's at least no projection that these problems, whether it's droughts in the US and fires, I mean, if you take forest fires in US, I mean, it's starting to really have an impact on the raw material supply. And all of these things, I think, are something that the industry has to spend a lot of money researching and come up with what is the next generation of when we now plant trees that can maybe survive in a slightly warmer climate, etc., and so on. So certainly, yes.
Okay.
It is a concern.
Okay. Moving on from that related topic, moving back to the idea of planting, and you talked about the emotional response from people about forest and production of forests. Well, what's the role then of we've got a sort of a split in people's thinking. On the one hand, we know we have to reduce the amount of carbon we use in materials and buildings and design and so on. And on the other hand, we have people's negative perceptions of cutting trees down and making use of our forests. What do we think is the role then for really going hell for leather in our communications about low carbon buildings and timber as a low carbon design material in order to change perceptions about forests? Mike, I'll start with you. I know AHEC has been a kind of global expert in highlighting design and engaging designers and architects and so on. Do you think that that's going to still be the right way to go to balance out that perception?
It is, but at the end of the day, it comes down really to communicating the science. in an emotional argument, you're going to lose, despite what the facts are. An emotional argument is not something you want to engage in. And, we do have, a long series of, peer-reviewed, science essentially showing the benefits. Yet people still have a hard time wrapping their heads around it, because it's something that's, something that since you're a child, and reading Dr. Seuss, and of course the bad guy is always the one that's cutting the tree down, and the hero is always the one sitting up in the tree. And, you're going against people's preconceived notions. It's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
But it's one that I think, if we join into it, I mean, it's there. You look at it from a communications perspective. You imagine, I can't remember who it was a couple of years ago, talking about, imagine if you right now, you invented wood.
Yes.
There's something that only requires sun and rain. It's, no chemicals, no pesticides, only sun and rain. It sequesters carbon, it renews itself. I mean, if you invented that right now, your market cap would be up there with Google.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have this, we have this out there, but we've always been good at telling the story to each other.
Yes.
I think we've been less good at telling the story to the wider world.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we look at the wider world, Rupert, do you think that there is scope for, I mean, one of the main problems in the tropics is you highlighted that there won't be the domestic demand for the products that are actually growing there. Is there, we heard a lot from, moves in Gabon and countries like this, slightly more enlightened places, to do more in terms of building with timber, building with wood. Do you think there's scope to increase that, to try and increase the sort of the forestry base, then the forestry industries within tropical countries, as we're doing here?
Yes, and a lot of the challenges, of course, are similar to the ones I think that the American Hardwood Export Council has as well. It is expanding the range of species in use, because of course in the tropics there has been a very heavy focus on a rather limited range of higher value commercial species. So often the actual demand doesn't really reflect what the forest can supply on a sustainable basis. So that's something that needs really to be focused on. But this question of utilizing more tropical wood in tropical countries themselves is one that is actually not frequently raised, and I think it is something that needs to be looked at in much greater detail, because these are the countries where there is going to be a lot of population growth. There's going to be a rapid move to urbanization in these countries. We know that their construction sectors are very heavily dependent on high energy materials like cement, and there are all these large areas actually of relatively so-called degraded forest, which could provide a sustainable supply of materials. But in order to use these materials, you do need a lot of investment in research and development. All these things that the tropical countries, of course, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, they lack this sort of level of investment. And one of the big challenges is to get the investment into these countries for producing and manufacturing new sustainable materials that they can use locally for their own construction sectors. Okay,
I'm going to move on to some of the questions that have come in from the audience, just as we're closing up. And I'll start, Mike. There was a question here about you'd mentioned the availability of red oak and things. Somebody had asked, essentially, could we start using this for engineered timber products, so that there is as Ollie said, there's going to be a huge growth in CLT, but it's not just CLT. There are a lot of other engineered timber products. They use a lot of wood to make those mass timber products. Can red oak be utilized in that way? And has anyone tried it?
Well, we've been we've got actually some grant research money right now to look at red oak on some structural uses, but more along the lines of LVL and so forth. What we have shown on the CLT is actually that yellow poplar, the tulip wood, We've done a couple of demonstration projects, in the UK, as you're aware of. I think there's part of one at the building center right now, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah.
From Andrew Waugh, and that's been proven that it's the strength to weight ratio of the yellow poplar is superior to the softwoods that they had been using. The potential is certainly there. The issues though, and bringing this out, there's been a couple of attempts here in the U.S. as well. Part of it is the way that the sawmills cut the hardwood, where it's random width, random length, depending on what we're using it for. So whereas the softwood's coming off as the 2x4s, and they're coming out in exact dimensions every time, it's much easier. There's an extra step in there when you start using that. So we have a bit, when we look at expanding some other species, particularly hardwood species, for things like CLT, we've got a bit of the the chicken or the egg.
Yes.
Sawmills aren't gonna cut to dimension unless there's a market for them, and nobody's going to invest in a CLT plant using hardwoods unless there's ready supply.
Yes.
So it's either going to take somebody big to do to put both ends together, but the potential is certainly there. I'm not sure. I think we did, and again, I have to do this. And I'm an economist. I'm not a wood scientist, but I know that we did look at red oak, and I know David Venables was doing some of that work with us. And the reason that we went with tulip wood, it's another very, very abundant species, but I think it had properties. But I'm simply not knowledgeable enough on those exact properties to discuss why we went with the tulip wood and not with the red oak.
Okay, no problem. On a similar basis, I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on the question about the growth of engineered timber. We had a question saying, from an engineering perspective, and I'm not sure any of us will know this, can we expect the quality, so the characteristics of strength and durability of timber, to reduce over time with the increase in plantations and disease and this, that, and the other, and changes in climatic conditions? Are we going to expect the quality of timber to decline over time? And will that, I guess, related to this, sort of obviate the need to make more engineered products and so on?
Can I say a word from the UK perspective, because it's actually something quite close to my heart, is that we've not had a forestry sector for very long. You're growing trees which have kindly been donated to us by our American cousins. We found they grow here very well. We've had a perception that the trees here grow too quickly and therefore don't offer much in the way of structural strength. But what we've done is we've invested in universities who are understanding the properties of the trees that we grow. And they're now identifying that the structural strength of the trees that we have don't relate to the speed of growth, which was the issue before, but it can be identified at a cellular level. And what we're doing from that is learning how can we identify those trees which will grow both quickly and will also provide structural strength. So for me, there's a fantastic and very exciting opportunity in our sector to look at how can we improve production and also improve the quality of the trees that we have. And that's something we relied on in the past just from selection of species, but now we're bringing in the scientific community to that. I think there is great steps that we can be taking. It won't be in the next 2 or 3 years, but it certainly will be this century.
Yeah, and it should be a focus of research in all countries, really, for forest growth.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, as I said, I think I can only talk from the UK. I look enviously at the research and the progress that has been made in places like Scandinavia and North America, and I'm sure they are focusing on this as well. But I think it is something that across the globe, we've got real opportunity to do more on.
Okay, we're rapidly reaching our time limit. I'm just going to quickly ask everybody, which was one of the main questions that's come up. We've seeing a lot of data now about trade flows and what's happened during the pandemic and the increase in demand and what's happened with production. Are we going to run out of wood? Stuart, you're on the screen. I'll start with you, and I'm going to go around to ask everybody. Last question.
No, we're not. We're going to produce more. And as long as we can keep those pesky pests and diseases in check, we'll be okay.
Thank you. Rupert?
Well, my answer to that, no, I don't think so. I mean, the challenge is to make more use of the trees that are available from the forest. There's plenty of fiber, but we need to use a wider diversity of species.
Okay. Mike?
Well, Rupert stole my answer. So.
Yeah.
But it's a resounding no, we're not going to run out of trees anytime soon.
Okay. And Ollie?
No, I don't think we will run out of wood, but we have to use it.
Yes.
In a better, more efficient way. There will be more engineered wood products, and maybe also that it should also be combined with other materials, and maybe we have to also get used to that it will not be the end of the wood will have a significant higher value.
Yes.
As we go.
Yeah, and that is one of the trends we haven't touched on today, but I think we can safely cover that one off at another point. In the meantime, I'm getting told we are running out of time. We said we were going to finish at 6 o'clock. Thank you to all of our speakers, to Stuart, to Ollie, to Mike, to Rupert, and thank you for everybody for tuning in. These presentations, this whole session has been recorded and will be going up on our YouTube channel next week. Thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.